You were listening to the U.S. Defense Secretary and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff speak from the Pentagon as the conflict with Iran enters its fifth day. Pete Hegseth announcing the United States and Israel will have complete control of Iranian skies in under a week. He said more U.S. forces are arriving to the region as he claimed America is winning this war. General Dan Kane said Iran has been indiscriminate and imprecise in their attacks, adding the United States have sufficient precision munitions for the task at hand. For more on all of this, we can bring in France 24's foreign affairs commentator Douglas Herbert, who was listening to that with me. Doug, question for you. Will U.S. allies in the region be placated by what they heard just there?
Placated
In the sense that they have been bearing the brunt of Iran's wrath over the past few days as Iran lashes out at the U.S. and Israel. GCC countries have been bearing the brunt. U.S. interests, but not solely, have been targeted in these countries. It seems like the U.S. says things will be under control in a couple of days, but not just yet.
Hard to be placated, perhaps still in a state of alarm, namely because we saw sort of a tag team effort there. Pete Hegseth, who, when he was, you might remember, when he was nominated, was on the brunt of tremendous criticism, not just from the Democrats, but mostly Democrats, that he was the most unqualified and unserious defense secretary in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
A man serially unfit for the job. And since then, his critics, at least, have pointed out that time and again, his tone, whether he's talking to reporters or whether he's talking to his own generals, you'll remember he convenes all the generals, has been sort of action hero-like, bombastic, jingoistic, chest-thumping, glib, smug. Use the adjective that you will, and I don't think we really saw a change of tone today. This was a defense secretary which was in sort of full-on
G.I. Joe mode.
Beholden, paying fealty to his great leader, Donald Trump, marching in lockstep with Donald Trump's message, and being the Trump whisperer when it comes to this war of choice, which is what it is, a war of choice in every respect. His language spoke for itself. You don't have to do too deep a dive to analyze it. He said we're playing for keeps. He says this was never meant to be a fair fight. We are punching them while they're down.
Yeah.
There was a gloating aspect to his remarks. Now, contrast that with Dan Kane, obviously a Trump appointee, someone who has Donald Trump's full confidence. He's there more in the clinical facts and only the facts man mode. He is trying to give literally a war report, taking stock of what's happened so far. So for allies who are looking for any sort of reassurance, if you could, as much reassurance as you can get at a Pentagon press briefing from an administration that launched a war where it still doesn't seem to have figured out the reasons it did so.
Yeah.
As much as you can, he might have given reassurance in some of his statistics, which I jotted down. He said that Iran's ballistic missile strikes were down 86% from the first day. He said that the one-way attack drone strikes were down 73%. The message being projected here, and this was from the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, the clinical, factual presentation, the message was very loud and clear, that yes, a layman looking at this operation sees a spiraling out-of-control conflict with the potential for great unpredictability and chaos. But as the military man in this room and the one overseeing and commanding these operations, I can tell you that what you're actually seeing from a military standpoint is the decimation of the Iranian Navy and Army. And it very specifically spoke about the U.S. warship, a U.S. submarine torpedoing and sinking an Iranian warship that thought presumably it was in safe international waters, a warship that was in the Indian Ocean. If that's the case, corroborated through this press briefing, it would probably be the first case of a warship of that kind being torpedoed at full sea by an American submarine since World War II. So the clinical, factual, statistical presentation, to the extent that any of this can be reassuring to allies who never wanted to be brought into this in any way, shape, or form, never wanted to be dragged into it. Dan Kane, the Joint Chief of Staff's presentation, in that respect, in a military sense, you could at least say he was striking the right notes. It was reassuring, and he was trying to project the image that we are decimating Iran's ability to counterstrike, to attack, to strike back with missiles. We are degrading their ability to do that. But Pete Hegseth was very much in that jingoistic, patriotic, bombastic tone, and there was no getting away from that.
So we have no clarity on what exactly the U.S. Is doing in Iran or why it's there. And we don't also have clarity on a timeline, because when Pete Hegseth started, all he kept saying was it's been 4 days, it's been 4 days, but he didn't really lay out how long it's going to last.
Yeah, and in fact, on the contrary, he said this is not a mission accomplished situation. Obviously, an allusion to the now notorious statement by George W. Bush just days after he landed on a U.S. warship during the early phases of the U.S.-led Iraq invasion, saying mission accomplished. We know what happened next, 20 years of war and occupation and a lot of horrific deaths in that region, across the region. So not mission accomplished, as he put it, a reality check. And he has refused to be drawn on a timeline because the timeline's been all over the place. Yes. Clearly, Donald Trump has been clear that he would like this to be shorter as opposed to longer. Originally he put a 4 or 5 week timeline on this, but remember, this is a president who speaks. It's almost the political equivalent of Tourette syndrome in a sense. He says in the moment something, and then everyone around him is forced to sort of make what he said make sense. They have to march to the drumbeat of whatever their commander-in-chief says. So when Donald Trump says 4 or 5 weeks, but the commanders and the military commanders know that there's very much the potential that this is going to go on well beyond 4 or 5 weeks, they have to say that. So they were very clear. If anything, they were very clear that there's no timeline because there's no timeline. By the very nature of a military conflict where you don't know necessarily what the consequences of an effect are going to be, they can't be drawn on when this is going to end. Remember, Donald Trump himself, when it comes to timelines, the president who famously campaigned on ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, didn't say it once or twice or 3 times. He said it multiple times. And ever since then, his term back in office, his second term back in the White House, has been an exercise in sort of peddling back on those statements and finding ways to reframe it. So what we're hearing is almost by the hour, not by the day, we are seeing an administration that is trying to make a very confused narrative, a narrative that is anything but harmonious and anything but coherent at this hour, at least seem to take on the air of cohesion, to try to, after the fact, try to put a plan to actions, to sort of do everything in reverse. Here's what's happening, and by necessity, this is what the plan always was.
So, Doug, we don't have clarity on the goals of this mission. We don't have any further details on the timeline that's been set. We don't know who's going to rule Iran. There was a question asked by a reporter of reports that the U.S. was thinking of mulling funding Kurdish militias. Pete Hegseth seemed to wash his hands clean of that. But that essentially, if that were to happen, could risk some civil war breaking out in Iran, which would invariably destabilize the Middle East even further than what we're already seeing right now.
There are so many variables in this equation, well beyond, forget what Donald Trump knows or doesn't know about the complexities of this conflict. Even his own commander, even experts who follow this region, it is overwhelming, the complexity of the different groups, their varying allegiances, their varying alliances. I mean, even if you take the main players right now, the main players, putting it mildly, the U.S., Israel, and the Gulf, the Persian Gulf countries that are supposedly the allies to varying degrees of the U.S. and Israel, or at least right now, hosting a lot of their bases and also bearing the brunt of a lot of these incoming missiles and drones. Even them, even among that supposed bloc that is all together in this war against Iran right now, even they have very divergent at times reasons, motives, agendas, and hopes and aspirations here in this conflict. So when you bring in various groups and militias and the Iraq and the Kurds in the north of Iraq as well, and the Iraqi Kurds, it gets enormously complex.
Yeah.
And I think it's a pretty safe bet that whatever planning did or did not go into this war in the Situation Room, in the hours preceding those first strikes, pretty safe bet that the Iraqi Kurds were not prominent on the table in the Situation Room discussion. There was a little satirical front cover of a British magazine called Private Eye this week, and it shows basically Donald Trump sitting there, with his advisors, and one of them says, "Why have you started this war?" Speaking to the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, and he said, "So that I can stop it." And while that seems a little glib and tongue-in-cheek cheek to a lot of people looking on, it does seem like a war that didn't have to happen. Now it is happening, and now the narrative is being framed in such a way that all efforts are being made to be as swift and precise and as overwhelming in the unparalleled American military might, as the whole world knows no army can match it, to make sure that this horrible, horrific war can come to an end.
And we also have reports coming in today that NATO forces shot down a missile which was heading to Turkey. This is, of course, something that the Secretary of Defense was asked about, and he said that action would not necessarily trigger Article 5. But what happens if Iran did choose to send a missile to a NATO member state?
Well, we don't know, right? And just as we don't know, this is not some abstract question you're throwing at me. We've raised this exact question with respect to the war in Ukraine, where missiles have not just strayed close to NATO borders, but have occasionally strayed over those borders into NATO airspace, have been shot down. Afterwards, it was damage control, it was an accident. We're not quite sure what the intentions were, trying to frame the narrative in such a way as to tone down any sort of belligerent intentions or motives behind these missiles. Likely the same thing. All efforts will be taken to try to read a narrative that this was not a direct threat to a NATO member, so that Article 5 doesn't have to be tested, doesn't have to be brought into play. But obviously, the very fact of what you're saying, that an Iranian military projectile reportedly heading into Turkish airspace and being shot down by NATO air defenses, because Turkey is a NATO member that happens to border Iran, obviously that's going to raise more than a few eyebrows and also heighten the awareness of just how volatile and chaotic and tricky these regional conflicts can become. You know, it's obviously an aphorism to say that, you know, wars are much harder to end than they are to start. And in this particular conflict, given all the factors and the countries that are already within just a few days, we're in day 4 to 5 of this conflict right now, of this war, how many countries have been brought into play, and now add to them Turkey potentially today. And you have a sense when Pete Hegseth starts his news conference by saying we're just 4 days into this conflict, you have a sense of just what the potential is for complications or unanswerable questions to come in the next hours or days. Do they hope that it doesn't come to that? Obviously they do. But there was not a sense, going back to your original question, of the reassurance that they have control of the timeline and that they have control of the chain of events that can string together in a very short time. Remember, already in this war, in the opening phases of this war, they've launched more, that is, the U.S. and Israeli operation has launched more projectiles into and thrown more military hardware at Iran than you saw in the opening phases of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq back in 2003, in the very opening phases. So that's saying a lot about both the intensity and, as Pete Hegseth said, was very clear about, a conflict, a war right now that is not decelerating, but accelerating.
And he said the U.S. was still investigating reports that a school was targeted in Tehran, a girls' school.
Right.
Still no word on who would have launched that strike, whether it was Israel or the United States. So we'll see what comes.
Let me just, one last
Very
thing
briefly.
before, very briefly. Remember, this is a joint U.S.-Israeli operation, but we didn't really also get a sense as to where the Israeli operation begins and ends and where the U.S. operation begins and ends, and how much U.S. and Israel marching in locksteps. Who is calling the shots here? Do they have the same objectives, the military objectives? Do they both know what the other's objectives are? Presumably with Israel, it's regime change. They've been very explicit about that. Does the U.S. share those objectives of regime change, or is there some other reason?